Okay, welcome everyone. Sorry for the delay. We had some problems with the room. We were very happy to have Massimo Renzo from the Faculty of Law. Massimo has worked extensively on the philosophy of criminal law, the ethics of war, the nature and justification of authority, and today's giving a paper titled Two Kinds of Consent. And then we have Max Kiener from the philosophy department, who works also on the morality of consent, giving a comment. So, Massimo.
Great, thanks so much for having me. Thank you all for coming. Okay, so I'm going to start with a couple of points about consent, which hopefully are not controversial. So consent is a normative power that enables us to release others from obligations that they owe us. So by consenting, what we do is we waive the claim rights that correlate to those obligations, and so we make it pro tanto permissible for others to treat us in ways that, had we not consented to, would be wrongful. Of course, the behavior, the conduct might still be wrongful, all things considered, but it's not wrongful in one respect, in which it would be wrongful had we not consented. So philosophers agree about this much. What they disagree about, one of the things that they disagree about, is how consent operates. They disagree about what we need to do in order to exercise this moral power and give morally valid consent. So this is sometimes referred to as the question of the ontology of consent. So there are two main views on the table. There's a third view, but not many people take that view, so I'm going to leave that view aside. There's the mental state view and what I call the behavioral view. The mental state view says that you consent to me doing X when you form a certain mental state. For example, when you mentally waive your right that I don't do X. So there are other formulations of the mental state view, but I'm going to operate with this one. So I consent when I form a certain mental state. The behavioral view says that you consent to me doing X when, in addition to forming such mental state, you behave in a certain way in order to communicate to me the content of your mental state. So communication may be verbal or it may be non-verbal, but crucially forming the mental state is not sufficient to give a permission. In order to give a permission, in order to consent, you also need to communicate or perhaps attempt to communicate. I'll come back to this point in a little bit. Now, to be sure, defenders of the mental state view acknowledge that communication plays an important role in our practice of giving consent. And that's because once you have formed the relevant mental state, you also need to let me know that you did form the mental state so that I can act based on this important piece of information. But the role of communication here is simply to inform me that the relevant normative change has happened. The normative change, the magic of consent, if you like, happens when you form the mental state. Communication simply provides me with evidence of the fact that the normative change has happened. Not so for the behavioral view. For the behavioral view, the normative change happens only once communication, or at least an attempt to communicate, takes place. So in the first part of the paper, I can criticize what seems the popular strategy in the contemporary debate to solve this problem, which consists in comparing consent to other normative powers, for example, promising or abandoning or commanding. I'm not presenting that part of the paper, but I'm happy to discuss it later in the Q&A if you'd like to. I'm going to go straight to what I think is the best way to answer the question of the ontology of consent, which is, I believe, to connect this question more closely to the question of the justification of consent. So I argue that in order to answer the question of how consent operates, we need to think about why we have the normative power to consent. So there's a connection between how the power operates and why we have the power to begin with. But I think this connection hasn't received enough attention in the philosophical debate. And my suggestion will be that if we do that, we have some reason to adopt a version of the mental state view. But my priority here really is not to defend the mental state view. The main goal of the paper is methodological, if you like. So I would suggest that in addressing the ontological question, as well as in addressing the justificatory question, it's a mistake to focus primarily on the consenter, as most theories do. I think we need to pay more attention to the role played by the consentee. And I think if we do that, we'll see that there are two types of consent which are grounded in different autonomy-related interests that underlie the justification of consent. So let me say something about the justification of consent. So think about why we value having the power to consent. We have the capacity to change our normative relationship with others by way of consent because having this capacity is valuable to us in some respect. But if the existence of the power to release others from certain obligations is explained by the fact that being able to exercise this power is desirable in some respect, then it's only to be expected that the power will operate so as to facilitate whatever makes the exercise of the power desirable. So we need to think about why is it desirable that we have this power, the power to consent, the power to release others from certain duties. And a plausible answer, at least part of a plausible answer, will appeal to the value of autonomy. I'm not saying that this is the whole story, but that seems to be an important part of the story. So the idea here is that being able to control the consent-sensitive duties that others owe us is valuable because it increases our capacity to exercise our self-determining agency and to shape our life as we wish. So for example, I can realize the plan of staying healthy by consenting to surgery, or I can realize the plan of feeding my child by consenting to you taking my money in exchange for pizza. It would be much harder for me to pursue these projects if I wasn't able to make it the case that others don't wrong me by touching me or by taking my money. If I lack that power, you might well refuse to do these things because doing those things would involve engaging in acts of wrongdoing. And even if you could be persuaded to play along, then the realization of these plans would be secured only at the cost of turning you into a wrongdoer and of turning me into the victim of wrongdoing. So wrongful interference with some of our most important moral rights, right to bodily integrity, the right to property, would then be necessary in order to realize some of the basic goals of human existence. So I think something like this story, though not exactly in these terms, is what is offered by people who ground the great justification of consent on autonomy. Now this story focuses on the autonomy of the consenter, but I want to stress that consent is also meant to serve the autonomy of the consentee by enabling the consentee to choose how to act without running the risk of becoming a wrongdoer. So on the one hand, the consenter has a powerful interest in controlling the duties that others owe the consenter so as to avoid becoming the victim of wrongdoing. On the other hand, the consentee has a powerful interest in knowing which duties he or she owes the consenter so as to avoid becoming a wrongdoer herself. So consent is not best conceived as protecting our personal capacity to exercise our autonomous agency, but rather to facilitate what we might call interpersonal exercises of autonomy. So it's a tool that enables both consenters and consentees to pursue their project while reducing the risks of being involved in acts of wrongdoing, either as victims or as perpetrators. So suppose that this autonomy-based justification of consent is plausible. What are the implications for how we should think about the ontological question? Well, it looks as if we have reason to abandon at least one version of the behavioral view, the version of the behavioral view which requires uptake for consent. By this, what I mean is that in order for consent to be given, the consenter has to communicate the presence of the mental state, and the consentee must understand this message, the message that is being communicated. Why do we have reason to abandon this view? Well, it would be much harder for the consenter to be able to control the duties that others owe her if, in order to do that, the consentee would need to understand the message communicated by the consenter. Any attempt to consent would be hostage to fortune, as it were, because whenever our attempt to communicate turned out to be unsuccessful, we are unable to change our normative relationship with the consentee. So perhaps I want to consent to using my bike. I tell you, you can use my bike, but you're distracted, you don't hear me. So now I can't change the duties that you have. Perhaps I send you an email, it gets caught in your spam filter. Now I can't change the duties that you have. And so if it's valuable for me that I'm able to change your duties, then it's harder for me to secure this result. Vice versa, if all it takes to give valid consent is that I form a certain mental state, then I have full control over the duties that you have, because it's easy for me to form a mental state, whether or not then you're able to have access to my mental state. But perhaps the behavioral view can be rescued if we reformulate the behavioral view so that what the view requires is not successful communication, but attempted communication. Because attempting to communicate is something that falls within our control, even if the word doesn't cooperate because the email I send you gets caught in your spam filter. It's within my control to make an attempt to communicate to you that I consent to you taking my bike. So now it looks as if we should choose between this weaker version of the behavioral view or the mental state view, if we think that one reason to if one reason to choose an answer to the question of the ontology of consent depends on which of these answers best protect the autonomy of the consenter. So here's a powerful argument that Victor Tadros has offered for the weak version of the behavioral view. So Tadros says, well, think about what the function of duties is. The function of duties is to constrain our practical reasoning. So when I consent to you doing X, what I'm doing is executing an intention to affect your practical reasoning. But I could not intend to execute an intention to affect your practical reasoning without attempting to communicate with you. So it's because I couldn't conceivably try to affect your practical reasoning without attempting to communicate, that attempting to communicate has to be part of what it takes to give consent for Tadros. So I have an objection. I'm going to summarize Tadros' view rather quickly, and I have some objections to that are internal to his own view. But what I want to do here is challenge the general idea that when we consent, we are necessarily executing an intention to affect other people's practical reasoning. I don't think that this is always the case. So consider this scenario. Suppose that I see my estranged son who's about to take some money from my car without my permission. I cannot even attempt to communicate with him because I'm observing this scene from a security camera. But I don't want my son to become a thief, and I don't want to be the victim of his wrongdoing. So what do? I consent to him taking the money by forming the relevant mental state, the mental state of waiving my claim that he doesn't take the money. When the police catch my son, I can honestly say that he wasn't stealing because I consented to him taking the money. So here we need to tread carefully. So I'm not denying that my son's conduct might be wrong, all things considered. It probably is, unless he has a justification for taking the money. And I'm not denying that my son's conduct wrongs me either. Trying to take someone's money without their consent is disrespectful, and there's nothing I can do to change that. My claim here is that even if my son's conduct is wrong, all things considered, and even if it wrongs me in some other ways, it doesn't wrong me in this distinctive way in which I'm wrong when my consent has been violated. I don't suffer this particular wrong because I managed to consent to my son taking the money. Now, I'm sure that some of you will disagree. Some of you will have a different intuition in this case. If there is a clear case of consent on which everyone's intuition will converge, this is definitely not it. But my strategy here is not to rely on intuition to convince you of my analysis of the case. I want to go the other way around. I want to convince you that this analysis of the case nicely fits with the autonomy-based justification that I offered you. So if you think that that's a convincing story, then you have reason to accept that in this case, I can consent to my son. And if you believe that, then you have reason to reject the idea that consent necessarily involves trying to affect other people's practical reasoning. And then that means that we have reason to abandon Tadros' view. So think about, again, this idea that we value being able to control the duties that others owe us because this increases our capacity to shape our life as we wish. Now, an account of consent that gives me the capacity to control other people's duties in cases like my attempted theft case seems to be an account of consent that gives me more, that serves this goal of being able to shape my life as I wish better than a view of consent that doesn't give me that capacity, right? So suppose that there are these two views of consent we need to choose between. One says, I am able to consent to my son in that case. And one says, you are not able to consent to your son because you can't consent unless you at least attempt to communicate. Well, the first view gives me this choice. I can choose whether to consent to my son and then prevent him from wronging me, or I can choose not to consent to my son if I prefer to suffer this wrong and perhaps avail myself to whatever remedy is available for someone who's been wronged in this way. Whereas the other view leaves me at the mercy of my son's attempt to wrong me. There's nothing I can do. I can only be a victim in that case. So having the power to consent gives me the valuable power to frustrate my son's effort to wrong me by stealing my money. So if this understanding of the autonomy-based account is correct, we should conclude that the consenter can change the normative status of a conduct without necessarily trying to affect the practical reasoning of the consentee. And I think that this in turn undermines Tadros' argument for the weaker version of the behavioral view, and this lends some support to the mental state view. In the paper, I discussed also how this sort of account protects also the autonomy of the consentee, but we'll discuss that in the Q&A if you're interested. Okay, so suppose that you are convinced by this argument, and I hope you are. Even so, I think there's a sense that something is missing, even if you accept that I have the power to consent in this case. You will have the feeling that something is missing in cases like this. It's hard to shake off the feeling that things don't go as they should in this case. And I think the problem here can be framed in terms of direction of fit. So what happens in the scenario that I've offered is that I change my will so as to prevent my son's behavior from wronging me. But this is not how things ideally should go. Ideally, it should be the other way around. So we normally hope to use consent as a way of guiding other people's behavior so that their behavior will not wrong us. We normally don't hope to use consent as a way of adapting our will to what's going to happen to us anyway. And this is a feature of consent that surprisingly tends to be neglected in the philosophical literature, which largely focuses on the idea that the point of consent is to affect the normative status of the conduct that is being consented to. In fact, some deny altogether that consent has a guiding function. My colleague David Owens believes that consent is not a tool for controlling what is done to us, but rather a tool for controlling whether what is done to us wrongs or not. Now, I believe that my attempted theft scenario casts doubt on this claim. As I said, the reason something seems amiss in that case is that the point of consent is not simply to ensure that a given behavior does not wrong us, but that it doesn't wrong us in the right way. So ideally we want our consent to ensure that we are not wrong because our consent guides how others behave toward us, and not because we can adjust our will to what is going to happen to us anyway. And notice how this fits with the justification of consent that I gave you earlier on, right? If the point of consent is to enhance our capacity to shape our life as we wish, we should care not only that those who happen to take our money have our permission to do so, we should also care that they would not have taken the money if they didn't have our permission. So a view that gives people permission to take our money irrespective of whether they have taken into consideration our mental states, our intention to let them do so, is a view that I think does a worse job at protecting our autonomy than a view that makes the permission conditional on attempting to track our mental states, attempting to respond to our mental states. So, what does it take for the consentee to be guided by the exercise of our power to consent? Well, the idea is the one I just mentioned. I think the consentee's behavior must be sensitive to the presence of the mental state of the consenter. For the normative relationship between the consenter and the consentee to be changed in the right way, the consentee must acknowledge the intention of the consenter and do her best to respond to the mental state, the relevant mental states of the consenter. So there's this sensitivity to the mental state of the consenter, and which is missing from my attempted theft case. And I think that possibly something like this idea is what pushes some toward the behavioral view. I think that the thought that communication or attempted communication must be present for consent might be prompted by the belief that only by incorporating some form of communication we can vindicate the role that this kind of sensitivity ought to play within a theory of consent. But I think that this is a mistake. I think that the tendency to think that some sort of communication is necessary in order to have this sensitivity to the mental state of the consenter is induced by an assumption that seems to drive much of the contemporary discussion on consent, namely that in answering the ontological question, we need to focus on what the consenter does. Right? So the discussion is, does the consenter need to form a mental state, or does she need to communicate, or does she need to attempt to communicate? Now, I want to suggest that this is a mistake. In order to answer the ontological question, we also need to think about what the consentee does. Is the consentee doing her best to track the mental state of the consenter? So consent, at least in the ideal case, requires that the consentee does something. Now, of course, communication is really helpful when it comes to tracking the mental state of the consenter. It provides evidence of what these mental states are, and so it's easier to track the mental states if communication happens. But communication is not necessary. People who are in close relationships, such as partner or friends or relatives, might be good at reading each other's behavior and realize when the relevant mental state of waiving your objection that others behave in certain ways, when these mental states are formed, even before any attempt to communicate the presence of the mental state is made. And when that's the case, then you have ideal consent, even if there is no communication. Now, this claim might strike you as unrealistic. Perhaps you think that the risk of mistakes in tracking mental states is just always too high unless some sort of communication is happening. Now, I don't have an argument against this sort of skepticism, but we don't need one, because if you push this line of objection, you have already accepted that the problem with lack of communication is just the unreliability of a process that is supposed to track the mental state of the consenter without communication. So then you have already accepted that the point of communication is simply to provide reliable evidence that certain mental states are present. And this is precisely the role that the mental state view attributes to communication. So now it looks as if we have these two types of consent. There is the ideal case of consent, which involves presence of certain mental states plus the consentee trying to track these mental states. And then you have the cases like my attempted theft scenario that are defective somehow because you have the mental states but the consentee is not trying to track those mental states. And we might think that in these defective cases, some sort of remainder persists. Perhaps an apology is owed or some sort of compensation that would not be owed if the consentee was sensitive to the mental state of the consenter. And so I think that's exactly what we should say. We have these two types of consent. One leaves a remainder and the other one doesn't. And you might find this view puzzling. You might find it puzzling because you might think, look, either I waived my right over my money or I haven't. If I haven't waived my right over my money still persists, and so my son simply acts impermissibly. Or I have waived my right over my money, and so my son is simply permitted to take my money. So there's no violation that calls for apology or compensation or anything else. So either way, what is the point of saying that defective consent was given in this case? And I think there are two ways in which we might try to address this objection. The first way consists in just questioning the assumption that the right over my money is a single unit which either exists or doesn't exist. As I'm sure you've heard before, rights are best conceived as a cluster of different privileges and claims and liabilities and powers, and we shouldn't think that all these incidents stand or fall together. For example, when I let my apartment, I waive my claim that you don't live in it, but I don't waive other incidents that are constitutive of my property right. For example, the claim that you don't sublet my apartment or the power to sell my apartment, the privilege to access my apartment under certain conditions. But similarly, we might say that by giving defective consent, I waive my claim that my son doesn't refrain from taking my money, but I do not waive, for example, my power to demand an explanation for his action, or even to demand compensation, because saying that I'm not wrong if he takes the money is not saying that I am transferring title to him. Perhaps I'm just allowing to take the money for some time and then I want the money back. The fact that some of the incidents constitutive of my right have been waived explain why I have not been wronged by my son in the way in which I would have been wronged if I hadn't given defective consent. On the other hand, the fact that some of the incidents have not been waived explain why there is a moral remainder that might trigger a duty to compensate or apologize. So this is one way in which we can vindicate this idea of defective consent. An alternative approach points out that other normative powers are naturally analyzed along similar lines. I think forgiveness is a case in point. We might think that in the ideal case, forgiveness should be granted once the wrongdoer has acknowledged his wrongdoing and has repented and has apologized. However, many have noticed that there seem to be genuine cases of forgiveness where the wrongdoers haven't done any of those things. And it might be valuable that we are able to forgive people who are passed away or are not willing to repent because it serves some important function. Now these two views, conditional and unconditional forgiveness, are sometimes presented as alternatives, but it seems to me that they are just two moral phenomena that coexist in how we normally think about forgiveness. And one is the ideal case of forgiveness, and the other one is the defective case of forgiveness. And so perhaps consent has a similar structure. So for the purpose of this paper, we don't need to decide which of these argument is more convincing. All I want to say here is that they both vindicate the distinction between defective and ideal cases of consent, and that's all I want to do here. So, in conclusion, I've suggested that we need to revise how we theorize consent in two ways. First, we need to pay more attention to the relationship between the question of the justification and the question of the ontology of consent. And second, in answering each of these questions, we need to pay more attention to the role of the consentees. And if we do that, we'll see that there are two types of consent which are worth distinguishing, each grounded in a particular autonomy-related interest that we have. One type of consent is grounded in our interest to be able to control the normative status of certain interactions by guiding others to act in conformity with the conduct that we have decided to authorize. And another type of consent is grounded in our interest to be able to control the normative status of the same interactions when others cannot or will not be guided by what we have decided to authorize. And as I said, I think that the mental state view is probably the one that best fits with this sort of picture, but hopefully you'll find the picture convincing even if you don't subscribe to the mental state view. I'll stop here.
Well, thanks very much, Massimo. I think this is a very intriguing and genuine contribution to the field, and I think two aspects are particularly noteworthy. So that is that fresh and I think sophisticated take on how we should think about the methodology of the ontology of consent, combining what you say, the justificatory question and the ontological question. And a second thing I liked and I think is important is how you utilize certain aspects that have been used to support the behavioral view and show that they are either compatible with the mental state view or can be recast as support for the mental state view. I guess my overall worry with the position was that in order to defend your view in general, but also what you say about the mental state view, you have to reduce the transformative effect of consent or the function of consent to a considerable extent, which might be unpalatable, which then comes out in the Sun example, the main distinction between defective and ideal consent, but also in your claims about clusters of rights.
Mm-hmm.
I may come to that point, but make a few others pertinent to each of the sections in your paper. So you start out by saying that you talk about how consent operates, what we need to do in order to exercise this power of consent, and the ontology of consent. And you suggest that these are the same things, and I thought they were quite different. So when you talk about how consent operates, you're interested in questions like, does consent release people from an otherwise existing obligation? Does consent do so partially or completely? Is it more about rights? Then if you talk about what we need to do, you might think we have to form a certain mental state, like waiving one's rights, intending another person's conduct, verbally communicating with a gesture, which is quite different and independent from the first question, how consent operates. And then finally, third, the ontology of consent, what consent consists in, is still different. So I was wondering whether you could distinguish these three aspects at the very beginning of the paper rather than grouping them together, and you wouldn't damage your arguments. I think it would enhance clarity. The second terminological point, maybe, or conceptual point I was interested in when I read your paper was that you only distinguish between the mental state view and the behavioral view, and what you describe as the latter seemed to me rather a hybrid view, because you say the behavioral view claims that consent consists of a mental state and an act, communicative act. And I thought this was a hybrid view, whereas a behavioral view would say, no, consent consists only of a communicative act. And this is not a crazy view, because even if you have that view, you can make sense of the relevance of mental states, but it would be relevant in a different sense. You would say the relevant mental state is intending to communicate agreement rather than agreeing or waiving one's right. And you would think of the mental state not being constitutive of consent, but being a felicity condition of an illocutionary act. So if you think of a classical illocutionary act like christening, you must have the authority in order to perform that act. So it's a felicity condition of that act taking place, but it's not constitutive of that act. And I thought if you had three views on the table, you could critique and defend your own view in greater detail. So these were just two preliminary points about the first section, where I think you could open up a more detailed view and support. Then when you come to the justification of consent, I think it wasn't really clear to me why we should prefer your view and not follow David Owen's. So when you talk about these examples where you want to consent to someone taking your money in exchange of pizza, I think in all of these examples you talk about the value of people doing certain things, giving you pizza, operating or providing a medical procedure or whatever, rather than the value of having the authority or the power to authorize them. Because you might think we could have a scheme without consent where if your children are hungry, other people are obliged and permitted to give you pizza. Or if you are ill, the physician is allowed to perform a procedure without your consent, as it was the case in a long time ago, where consent didn't play a prominent role in medical ethics. So this is the first point. I wasn't sure whether you wanted to have a distinction between the value of other people's acts versus the value of having the power to authorize these acts. And then I think what I really liked about that paper is how you emphasize the interpersonal dimension of consent. And I think this is what makes it so interesting. But I wasn't sure whether the consenter's autonomy and the consentee's autonomy are on a par with regards to the justification of consent. So with regards to the question, as you say, and I quote, why we have the power of consenting to begin with. And it seems to me more natural to say the consenter's autonomy is the justification behind consent, but the consentee's autonomy is only a constraint on any acceptable account of justification. So we come up and say consent is valuable because it serves the consenter's autonomy, but any picture that we then present is only feasible if it also does justice to the consentee's autonomy, but that doesn't mean it's part of the justification. It seems to me a little bit implausible to say we have consent for other people. Of course it plays a role, but it's not the justification level. And then I come to the section on consent and autonomy, where you talk about Tadros and the example of the son taking money from your car without your permission. I guess my first question was that I wasn't really sure what consent does here, because you say I consent to him taking the money, but a few lines later you say I'm not denying that my son's conduct wrongs me, and now that's the interesting bit, insofar as trying to take someone's money without their consent is disrespectful. So I'd invite you to clarify if you think there was consent and in what way your son wronged you. And I think this is one of the cases where you could see that the function or transformative effect of consent is reduced considerably, because what consent really doing isn't really much anymore, because your son still wrongs you. And one thing that I was interested to see that you didn't take it up was whether or not it is a problem that the consentee, so your son's autonomy, is decreased in some way, because you might think, well, it's no longer within the power of your son to decide whether or not to wrong others. You could just say, well, now you're not wronging me anymore. Is this constraint or some on your son's autonomy curtailing that autonomy or his status as a moral agent? Because effectively you could just put a person in a situation where it's no longer possible for the person to do anything wrong, taking away moral agency. And then I was sympathetic to the idea that it might be valuable to have that power and prevent other people from wronging someone, but then I wasn't really, then I doubted that this is really valuable, because you have other legal means or moral means to say, well, I won't sue you, I won't blame you, I won't suffer any harm understood as setback of interest. It's really just about whether or not you're wronged or not wronged. And you might think, in a way in which Bernard Williams critiqued the idea that people are so concerned with what's the right and wrong action, this might be some form of moral fetish.
Can you say this again? I didn't. What would be a form of moral fetish?
So I mean, the idea would be that some people think, I'm really interested in doing the right thing. I'm visiting my friend in the hospital because I want to do the right thing. I'm not going to the hospital because I care about my friend. And Bernard Williams at some point suggested this might be some kind of moral fetish, because you're interested in this abstract thin property of rightness and wrongness rather than what's actually in the situation. And here I suggest a different point might apply. You say, oh, I'm interested in not being wronged here, even though what's actually at stake, all your interests are already resolved. So you can refrain from blaming your son, suing your son. You're not really harmed. None of your interests are set back. It's really just about being a person who has been wronged. And then in your presentation, you hinted at how the autonomy of the consentee, the role of the consentee, is taken into account by a mental state view, and said we could do that in the Q&A. And I'd like to invite you to say a bit more. I found it interesting what you said in your paper, where you said, well, you can never consent to something in the past. So this is one way in which the consentee can't be deceived or treated unfairly. And then you also say, well, if someone tries to mislead another person, this falls outside the scope of consent. So even if we agree with these 2 points, these are certainly on the periphery. So what's at stake when we think about whether or not we do justice to the consentee's perspective, we should talk about the ordinary cases, where people don't really know, was there really consent? Can I interact now? And these are cases where it's not about past action or deceiving others. And then my last 2 points concern what you said about what's missing, the direction of fit, and some of these ET type cases. So I found it very interesting when you said emphasizing the importance of communication is not a challenge to the mental state view. Quite the contrary, it reinforces its case, because it shows that this is so important as a way of accessing this bit of information, whether or not there has been the normative change. And I thought this was in a way question-begging, because those who endorse the behavioral view would say, no, this is so important because this is the thing that creates a normative change. So there is no question about access to an important bit of information. And I thought why you think this reinforces the case. So I think it's very interesting to say the emphasis on communication is consistent with a mental state view, because people thought there's an argument against it, and I think this is a very interesting claim, but I'm not sure whether it reinforces the case. You then talk about this in the paper, about this interesting machine where you could just find out whether another person consented, or whether another person had the relevant mental state, like waiving her right. And you don't think that'd be wrong if you had that machine, used that machine, and then did whatever you found consent for. And I thought it might be interesting to think about worries around mental integrity. Because you have this machine, but you don't have the permission to use them and look into another person's mind, you just use it. It seems to me you could claim it might violate that person's mental integrity and be wrong. And if that's wrong, then getting information from that machine and doing whatever you then do on the basis of these bits of information is also problematic. And then my final point is where in your paper you talk about these type cases in consent and say a person has to be sensitive to the consenter's intentions. And if the person's not sensitive, you don't get ideal consent, you get defective consent. But in the knowledge cases, if you're not sensitive to the evidence, you look at your watch, it's 10.1, it's 10 o'clock, and your broken watch actually indicates it's 10 o'clock. You have a true belief, but it's not knowledge at all in the first place. There is no knowledge. It's not defective knowledge, no knowledge.
Justified true belief. No.
That's not even justified.
It's justified.
I mean, in some cases it might be. But even if you say that it's not knowledge.
No knowledge, yeah.
But you say it's still consent, defective. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about this parallel between the knowledge cases and the consent cases. And that was also my worry, that you have to reduce the transformative effect of consent to defend the claims that you're making. But as I said, I think this is a genuine contribution to the discussion of the ontology of consent, and definitely help make progress on the topic. So thanks for sharing the paper.
Good.
Thanks, Max. Massimo, you want to give a brief response before you?
Okay, yeah, so thanks, Max. These comments are terrific. I won't be able to do justice to them. I'm just going to go quickly through some of the points. So you're right, there's a third view, which I think the third view is more interesting than most people. Not many people defend the third view of consent, the one that says it's purely communicative. There's a nice paper by Miller and Wertheimer in a collection, a recent collection of these. Renee Bollinger at ANU has a nice paper she's working on defending that view. So you leave it aside because the behavioral view seems to be the predominant view in the current debate. So that's the view that I wanted to take on. I think some of the reasons that I think push people toward the behavioral view are reasons to go all the way to the purely communicative view. I mean, I use behavioral just because a bunch of people in the literature use this term, and we can call it whatever. A hybrid view also sounds good to me. I was interested in your suggestion. I was intrigued by your suggestion that we shouldn't. Instead, what I suggest is that we should ground the justification of consent in the autonomy both of the consenter and of the consentee. And you say, here's an alternative. We just grounded it on the autonomy of the consenter, but the autonomy of the consentee is a kind of a side constraint. So I'll see that as an option. But I don't know if did you offer a motivation for why we should treat the autonomy of the consentee not as a justificatory ground, but just as a side constraint? I tend to think about these similarly to how we think about promising. In the case of promising, there's the interest of the promiser and the interest of the promisee. They seem to be both served in different ways by this practice. And I see consent as similar to promising in that respect. It is valuable, it's extremely valuable to me that I know when enacting a certain way I'm going to wrong you or not. And it's not clear why this shouldn't be part of the justification. So perhaps you just outline an alternative model, but I'm really curious about whether you think there's a reason to choose the side constraint. Is there a reason?
So I think the consentee's autonomy is, in an explanatory or justificatory way, derivative from the consenter's autonomy. So I think the reason why we have consent, and for that matter, I also think promises, is the consenter's or promises autonomy. So I could elaborate a little bit more, but I'm not sure if other people want to jump in as well.
We can talk more about that later. But so I thought that was a really interesting point. I wish I could read what I wrote. Trying to take the money. So you were talking about the defective case, and you say how can the son so if you have given consent, in what way is the son wronging you, right? You seem to presuppose that consent was not given, or there could not be any wronging, right? So that's the point that I was trying to address when I was distinguishing the different incidents of consent. So there are different ways in which you can spell that out. You might think that the son is wronging you by attempting to commit to engage in non-consensual behavior, but not for engaging in non-consensual behavior, because you have deprived them of the opportunity of it. And so that's one way in which you can explain that there are other ways in which you can do that by distinguishing the incidents. There's this intriguing thought that you have, which is, oh, but now you're failing to respect the autonomy of the child, of your son, because the son is deprived of the opportunity of engaging in this act of wrongdoing. So my view is that that's not a valuable exercise of autonomy to engage in this act of wrongdoing, and so depriving you of that capacity is not I don't wrong you by depriving you of the capacity of engaging in wrongdoing. So Raz is one of those who defend this view, although I think there are some interesting there's an interesting debate to have there. So quickly on my argument against the behavioral view being questioned by I wasn't using that as an argument to reject the behavioral view. So the arguments against the behavioral view are those that I give earlier on in the paper. All I was saying there in the argument that you mentioned is this. I've given you an argument that appeals to this idea that ideal consent only needs this tracking thing, even if there's no communication. And I think a natural reaction, people object that to me when I bring up that idea is, oh, but you could never know for sure that you are tracking the mental state if there's no communication. I think it's a natural thought to have. And all of my point there is that thought, that sort of objection doesn't put pressure on the view that I'm giving you. That presupposes that the view is correct. Smart defenders of the behavioral view don't raise that objection. I'm saying those who raise that objection are already presupposing the behavioral view. The last point I will mention is just this comparison between justified true belief and effective consent. So I think that there can be value in having a justified true belief. Right? So suppose I have to give my son a medicine at 10, and now if the clock tells me that it is 10, I can give my son the medicine. That's good for me. It's not as good as having knowledge. If I have knowledge, I have a modally robust version of this belief, and so I would be able to give my son the medicine at the right time, even if I check the clock in 10 minutes. So that would serve my purposes even better. But justified true belief is not bad. It's better than nothing. And I think that effective consent similarly is not, it's better than nothing, but it's not as good as ideal consent. I'll stop here.
Thanks very much to both, and now we will open for Q&A.